Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci d'être présent. On va commencer parce que, comme on dit, il n'y a pas de raison de punir ceux qui sont à l'heure. Voilà, donc bienvenue au Free Market Roadshow. Quelques mots. Alors d'abord, je me présente, je suis Pierre Garello et je suis professeur d'économie à Aix-Marseille, ça semble peut-être un peu à l'accent. Et puis je suis aussi affilié, je travaille pour IREF, l'Institut de recherche économique et fiscale, qui donc collabore avec le Austrian Center de Vienne pour organiser le Free Market Roadshow. Alors peut-être que Barbara, qui est ici, la présidente de l'Austrian Center, dira quelques mots tout à l'heure lorsqu'elle interviendra. Mais l'idée, c'est de diffuser de façon un peu autre la pensée libérale, un peu à travers l'Europe. Donc, il y a des stops, des étapes un peu dans toutes les grandes villes d'Europe, depuis de l'Europe, même jusqu'à la Géorgie, on va dire, de la Géorgie. Ils étaient hier à Londres, ils vont aller à Porto, etc. Et donc, ils tournent. Et puis, en général, ils amènent un peu dans leur bagage, en quelque sorte, quelques speakers, quelques conférenciers. Et donc, ça permet à ces villes d'avoir un peu un point de vue un peu différent sur ce qui se passe dans les différents coins d'Europe, et parfois même d'ailleurs, puisqu'il y a parfois des Américains dans ces Free Market Roadshow. Voilà. Donc, on a un joli panel que je présenterai dans un instant. Voilà. Et donc cette année, le IREF a décidé d'essayer de venir un peu prêter main forte, d'associer les réseaux. Voilà. Alors l'IREF, la plupart d'entre vous doivent connaître, c'est un institut de recherche économique et fiscale, dont la tâche première est d'essayer de promouvoir des politiques qui essaient de ramener un peu plus de liberté dans notre hexagone, voilà, dans tous les niveaux, que ce soit au niveau des politiques fiscales, des réglementations. Enfin, vous savez qu'on est un pays qui étouffe un petit peu. Voilà, donc les moyens qu'utilise IREF, c'est essentiellement essayer d'être présent dans les débats. Alors ça passe par une lettre quotidienne que certains d'entre vous connaissent, la lettre des libertés. Ça passe par des études, des notes, par un journal des libertés que vous pourrez regarder tout à l'heure, et vous pourrez prendre même un exemplaire gratuitement pendant la pause. Voilà, donc ça c'est le travail d'IREF, qui est un institut qui n'a aucune affiliation politique, qui travaille grâce à des dons, les dons de ses lecteurs, les dons des gens qui veulent venir appuyer notre démarche. Et puis il y a toute une équipe, il y a quelques membres de l'équipe ici, dont Elodie par exemple, qui peut-être vous en dira un peu plus tout à l'heure. Il y a aussi Nicolas qui est là. Voilà. Donc bienvenue. Alors ce soir, et c'est pour ça peut-être que des fois on a un peu de mal à attirer les grandes foules, mais on va être un peu anglophone. On va avoir 3 speakers, 3 conférenciers. Vous voyez, moi aussi je m'y mets. 4 conférenciers sur 5 qui vont faire leur conférence en anglais, mais vous pourrez vous poser vos questions en français. Voilà. Alors l'idée, on leur a dit, essayer d'être... ils ont chacun 25 minutes, essayez d'être pas trop long, comme ça il pourrait y avoir un échange, un peu une discussion, poser des questions en français ou en anglais, d'ailleurs ça c'est pas gênant. Voilà, alors s'il n'y a pas de questions, si j'ai rien oublié, Elodie, il y a quelque chose que j'ai oublié de dire, non? Ça va? Alors voilà, puisque vous n'êtes pas venu pour m'écouter, vous êtes venu pour écouter nos conférenciers. Alors on va commencer par Gissurarson, qui est, comme son nom l'indique un petit peu, islandais, qui est professeur à l'université d'Islande, qui a fait une thèse à Oxford sur la philosophie politique de Hayek, qui a été très présent dans le mouvement pour essayer de promouvoir les idées libérales. Il a été au conseil d'administration de la Société du Mont Pèlerin. Il est évidemment aussi très actif dans son propre pays. Il a été attaché au conseil d'orientation de la Banque d'Islande, qui, comme vous le savez, a connu quelques déboires au cours des dernières années. Voilà. Et donc j'ai eu l'occasion et le plaisir de rencontrer Annès de maintes fois. Et il y a un sujet sur lequel il travaille depuis quelque temps. Alors c'est un spécialiste aussi de ces expériences. Il s'est passé des choses intéressantes dans les pays nordiques. Vous savez qu'ils ont un certain amour de la liberté qu'ils cultivent depuis des siècles. Voilà. Et il a travaillé depuis quelque temps. On a eu l'occasion de publier ses travaux sur Rawls et Piketty et la moralité du marché, etc. Et c'est là-dessus qu'on lui a demandé d'intervenir, parce que voilà, Piketty, on connaît bien ici. On est presque dans sa maison, là, Paris 1. Voilà, donc on s'est dit que ça serait intéressant d'avoir le point de vue de quelqu'un qui vient d'ailleurs, en quelque sorte, sur Rawls and Piketty. So, Annès, I said only good things about you. Don't worry. And the mic is yours.
But, how can I...
So she cannot put it full screen, but because she needs connection, she has no connection. But she can have the slides.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here in Paris, in France. I must confess that I was extremely impressed when I was doing research on my book on 24 conservative liberal thinkers, impressed about the French liberals of the 19th century. In my opinion, they were actually superior to the English liberals of the 19th century. I am referring to Benjamin Constant and Alcide de Tocqueville and Frédéric Bastiat, and then early in the 20th century, Bertrand de Jouvenel. This is really a very impressive liberal tradition, rich in sociological insight and neglected in the Anglosphere. I think we have been dominated too much, however friendly I am towards the English and Americans, by them. And there are other kinds of liberalism, and there are also other kinds of anti-liberals. And I'm going to talk today about two left-wing gurus, John Rawls and Piketty. Here you see John Rawls, who published Theory of Justice in 1971. And here we have Piketty, who published a book that has been widely discussed recently, Capital in the 21st Century. Now, I would say that there are several weaknesses in Rawls' theory. His theory is more or less that we ought to have a just society where the worst off are as well off as they can be. This is what will be negotiated under a veil of ignorance, where people do not know their own interests or situation in the future. So it is a revived social contract theory. But there are several weaknesses there, some of them identified by one of my intellectual mentors, Robert Nozick. Why should you only worry about the worst off in society? Why can't we also take into account the best off, the most enterprising, the most productive? Are they not going to be at the bargaining table? Is it only about the worst off? And then another thing about the worst off is, doesn't it really make any difference how they became poor or were poor? For example, if they were poor because of sloth or gluttony, recklessness or so on, then one would say that they might have deserved to be amongst the poor. And then The problem really with John Rawls' theory of justice is that it isn't really a theory of justice. It's a theory of prudence. It's a theory of how we can seek security. That is what is being negotiated under the veil of ignorance in his thought experiment. And we can ask ourselves, do we really only seek security? I'm pretty sure that this is a very valuable thing, security, but there are other things. Some people want risk. Some people buy tickets in lotteries. Some people invest and so on. So isn't it possible, for example, that if we are really rational beings under the veil of ignorance, that we will negotiate a society where we have a safety net so that nobody can fall under the safety net, but that then after that it's all left to choice, how much you are in demand for your services. And then yet another problem about this is the extent of the society that's being negotiated. I mean, if we really do recognize a duty of ours to our fellow neighbors, then we have to define who those fellow neighbors are. And are we really going to construct our society around those who are worst off in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Or are we just talking about our own societies? So essentially, what Rawls comes down to is socialism is one country, an old slogan. And my question is really, if we are defining people relative to other people, and we have a genius like Mozart, is Salieri, who was more of a mediocrity according to the film, really made worse off by Mozart being a genius and him not being a genius? Isn't this the wrong way of approaching the whole thing? Shouldn't we, as a society, welcome people who are geniuses and who are extremely productive or creative? Is it a problem to have such people? We may have two societies. In one, everybody is more or less not very productive, and then you have another one, and there is one person that are very productive. Does it really mean that others are worse off by it? I think that's kind of a perverse approach to the whole situation. Let me just give you a thought experiment about all this. Let us assume that we have reached a distribution of income which would be just under Rawls's principles, D1. And then along comes Milton Friedman, and he gives a few lectures in Iceland, and he sells the admission to the lectures. Everybody pays $100 for the lecture, and he, when he returns to the US from Iceland, he is quite a lot richer because there are many people there that have bought tickets to his lectures. He is $100,000 richer, and there are 1,000 people who each is $100 poorer. And we have a new distribution of income. But what is unjust about the new distribution of income? Who has been harmed by the fact that his lectures were very popular? And this is, of course, the example that Robert Nozick gives in Anarchy, State and Utopia with Chamberlain. Very few people know actually that this is an example which has its origin in God and Man and Yale by William Buckley, but that's a different story. The point is different. It is this: if we have distribution by choice, what is wrong with some people getting rich? Because they are chosen by other people. They are in demand. But let us assume, just for the sake of argument, that Rawls has an interesting insight, which is that we may want a society where the worst off are as well off as they can be. Hayek, for example, said that he was faced with this during the Second World War when he was deciding where to put his children. In what kind of a society should he have put his children when England was being bombed? Should it be a society with a lot of security or a society with a lot of opportunity? And then it is an empirical question. where are the worst off as well off as they can be? And the answer is under capitalism. The Index of Economic Freedom is published every year, and here you can see what is the average income of the 10% worst off in societies, which is a reasonably plausible definition of the worst off, the 10% worst off. And you can see how much better off they are in general in the quartile of countries measured that have the freest economies. And another very interesting fact is that if you look at the column to the left, then actually the average income of the poorest 10% in the freest quartile is higher than the average income of everybody in the unfreest quartile. And this is really an amazing fact and a confirmation of Adam Smith's theory of how wealth is created through division of labor and free trade. So, capitalism passes with flying colors the Rawlsian test of what a just society should be, even if, as I argue, his theory is not of justice, it is of prudence. Then we come to Piketty, who has been much discussed, and there are many weaknesses in Piketty's approach. One is, for example, that he says that inequality has increased over the last decades or so, but actually global inequality has not increased, according to the Gini coefficient, because hundreds of millions of people in India and China and other countries in the South have marched from poverty to affluence. So globally, it hasn't happened. It has actually happened in the West, that we have a higher Gini coefficient than we used to have. And there may be systematic reasons for that. For example, that people with special skills who could only sell their skills to, say, 200 or 300 million people in the past now can reach the whole global market. People that can derive rent from their special skills. Then many scholars, they have pointed out statistical problems with Piketty's approach. For example, a real estate bubble will suggest that people are richer than they really are. And Martin Feldstein pointed out also that the tax cuts in the US, and which were followed by similar tax cuts everywhere else, made the high income or high income people much more visible than it had been before, because before, when the marginal tax rate had been very high, people had tended to take their income in other things, not in cash. So this was a question of visibility rather than of any reality. Then another thing about Piketty, if you read his book, then he argues, and there is some truth in it, of course, that if we have a society where some people are very, very rich and nobody else is quite rich, then we have dangerous power relationships. Money is power to some extent. But what he does neglect is the beneficial consequences of the rich. One such consequence is that the rich are the people who can afford to fight the bureaucracy, the government. When government tries to oppress the rest of us, they have the resources, they can sue government, they can go after officials and so on. We can see many examples of this in many countries. This is the first argument for the rich having beneficial effects. Let us put it this way, there is an invisible hand that leads the rich when they're enjoying their wealth to serve the public interest. This is one of it. Another one is that the rich, by being the first consumers of all kinds of luxury goods that then become cheap, they reduce innovation costs, experimental costs for the rest of us. Things like cars and airplanes and other such things, they used to be very expensive, and then in a gradual experimental process, they become so cheap that everybody can buy them. The third argument for the rich is that they are the sources of venture capital. We all know that we need innovation in a society, but then the question is, what is more likely to lead to progress and economic growth and innovation? To have hundreds or millions of investors, independently wealthy people who are investing money, venture capitalists, or to have one or two public funds where the majority makes a decision according to their preferences. And one extraordinary thing about Piketty's book is that his narrative is of wealth being glued to the rich, clinging to the rich. This is totally wrong. You have to create wealth anew every day. Let us just look at the lists of the richest people, both in the United Kingdom and actually in the world, that are published by Forbes and by the Sunday Times in the UK. And there you see the same picture in both lists that say 30 or 40 years ago, 2/3 of the people on the lists, they had inherited their wealth. They were titled people and so on, inheritors, heirs. Now 2/3 are people who created their wealth, entrepreneurs. If you just look at the lists, you can see this, you go through them. So this is also totally wrong. And I think actually that the difference between Rawls and Piketty is that Piketty is concerned about the rich. We shouldn't be concerned about the rich. We have to be concerned about the poor, poverty. I am finishing just by pointing out that Piketty quotes Balzac's novel Pierre Goriot a lot. But if you just read that novel, then you see that everybody in the novel has fragile wealth and basically is wasting it. It doesn't cling to people. And I'm not going to spend much time here on the last slide, which is just pointing out that income distribution is a necessary guidance for us for how we should utilize and develop our abilities and talents. It's a part of the price mechanism, and therefore I think both Rawls and Piketty are wrong with their schemes of redistribution. What you have to have is freedom of choice. Thank you.
Thank you, merci Hannes. So you should stay here maybe. We do have time for a couple of questions maybe, 2 or 3. Donc il a essayé de faire sa critique de Rawls et de Piketty en un quart d'heure, c'est un tour de force. So any question, any comment in French or in English? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Eamonn.
Well, first, I think it is a little bit unfair to call Piketty a charlatan. I think he really argues in the great tradition of political economy, like John Stuart Mill and John Maynard Keynes and Karl Marx. And I must say that I enjoyed reading his book. I thought it was totally wrong. But nevertheless, your question is justified. Why is that a book with such obvious flaws, like Piketty's book, becomes so popular and he becomes almost like a pop star? Well, one reason for this is that the left has been starved of ideas over the last 30 or 40 years. We must realize how difficult it must have been to be a man of the left after communism collapsed in the Soviet Union, and even after the Social Democrats in Sweden, they turned away from social democracy in the 1990s and gave it up. And suddenly capitalism became the only game in town. So there was a hunger for new ideas, and to some extent I think Piketty satisfied that demand. Also, I think that the universities become much more left-wing than they used to be, so there was a better reception to his ideas there. So I think these are the explanations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question for you. On your first slide, it showed us the 2 books we should not read. How about being positive, and what are the 2 best authors and the 2 books we should absolutely read?
Well, I grew up in a very left-wing environment, not because my parents were particularly left-wing, but everybody was in those days in the 1970s. And they came up with a lot of arguments that I tried to answer. So I decided to follow what I then learned was Mises' argument. You always have to answer them. You have to write books, and you have to give reasoned arguments to them. For example, one of the things that they told me is capitalism is going to waste all the resources of the world. There will be pollution and there will be overutilization of natural resources if you have capitalism, because capitalism is directed by greed. And then I realized, having read Hayek and Mises, that the right way to solve those problems was by defining private property rights to natural resources, and thus to take them into the custody of individuals, because environmental protection required environmental protectors, people of flesh and blood that had an incentive in protecting them. But if I would actually talk about books that we ought to read, I would say that the 2 books that made me a classical liberal were the Road to Serfdom and by Hayek, and then the Open Society and Its Enemies by Popper.
You've got an answer. So thank you again, Hannes. I think we should now move to the next speaker, Eamonn. Actually, a transition could have been, you should have said, the wealth of nation, for instance, or that would have given a good transition with the next speaker, Eamonn Butler, who is from the Adam Smith Institute, was trained, got a PhD at the university, or I forgot. Before moving to the US, where he taught for a while, before going back to England, and founded the Adam Smith Institute, which is basically doing policy papers, trying to change bad policies. So they work closely to the daily debate, and so he wrote a lot of things on price regulation, labor regulation, and so on and so forth. He asked me whether he should talk about Adam Smith. If only because it's the 3 centuries ago that Adam Smith was born. But I forced him to change the topic and maybe tell us a little bit about what is happening, your understanding of what's happening in the UK the last 20 years, since the Brexit, and maybe more recently with Liz Truss and so on and so forth. So I thought we should grab the opportunity of having you here to try to better understand what is going on over there right now. You have a PowerPoint, I think, on that. That's Elodie, this is your computer. Maybe if you... there is a PowerPoint here. It's... Regarde, il est là-dessus. Pardon? Je te laisse.
Okay. I've just done a few slides because I'm afraid I cannot speak to you in French. The school that I went to was run by the government, and therefore it was a very bad school, and it didn't teach me French. And I have to say my English isn't very good either. So I have prepared some slides, so hopefully you can read what I'm trying to say. on the Paris summit. Paris Butler. Is this, where's the PowerPoint? PowerPoint.
This one is it?
Let's see, it looks like it. You got it? And then we'll advance at this one.
I think you can just this.
Yeah. Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, I was asked to talk about the Brexit debate, so let me give you a British perspective on that. Brexit is very controversial, not just in Europe, but also in the United Kingdom. But I don't think it's really Brexit that is the point at issue. I think that it is the fact that our membership, accession and membership of the EU has always been controversial. Our Prime Minister, Edward Heath, took us into the European Union on simply a majority in Parliament. There was no referendum. Similarly, John Major signed us up for the Maastricht deal with only a vote in Parliament, and indeed it was so rushed that it's doubtful that any member of Parliament read the full document. So this has caused continual division, particularly between the elites and ordinary people. The elites have a more cosmopolitan point of view. They like easy travel and ease of business within Europe, whereas ordinary people in the pub, ordinary people worry about, well, we could have hundreds of millions of Europeans coming to the UK and taking our jobs, depressing wages, and we have other problems caused by that. So the elites and the ordinary people have very different points of view. And David Cameron, I think, as I say, the membership of the European Union was always a very controversial matter, particularly for the Conservative Party, since they've been in power for most of the time. And our Conservative leader, David Cameron, decided that he would get rid of this issue by having a referendum. And being a member of the elite, he assumed that there was absolutely no question that the British public would vote to remain in the European Union. So the campaign started, and the Brexit campaign, their slogan was to take back control. The feeling was that control and sovereignty had gone across the channel, and that the UK should decide its own laws. The UK was being ignored because everything was being decided by a club in Brussels, and we didn't really get much of a say, that it was becoming more and more centralized, that there was not really a proper democratic system, that it was wasting money that we could spend on important things within the UK, and of course that issue again of migration and jobs. The campaign was not only about migration, that was a feature, but that was not what it was about. There were many issues. And the result came as an absolute shock to everybody in power, to the cabinet and members of parliament, and to the Bank of England and the employers and the academics and the newspapers like the Times or the Economist. They were absolutely shocked because they hadn't really been listening to the voices of the ordinary people. If you went into the pub, you knew that things were not like that, that there was much more opposition than you would ever guess reading the newspapers. And even on the night, actually, the people assumed that the vote in the referendum had been lost and that we would vote to remain. In fact, I was in London and my wife was at home in Cambridge, and I went to a party which was run by the Leave campaign on the night of the referendum, and everybody was looking very glum because they assumed that they'd lost by a huge majority. That's what all the papers were saying. And about midnight, the leader of the Leave party came in and gave an interview and said, well, I'm sorry it didn't work this time, but we'll try again in a few years' time. So at this point, I rang up my wife in Cambridge and I said, you might as well go to bed, because if the leader of the Leave party says they've lost, then they've clearly lost. And I got a phone call at about 6:30 in the morning from my wife in Cambridge saying, you cost me the most exciting night of my life. Because exactly the opposite had happened. And we thought the UK was out. In fact, the BBC presenter at about 3 in the morning, when it was clear of the mathematics, said on TV, well, that's it, we're out. But we're still not really out. We've faced obstruction from the elites, intransigence from Brussels in particular, and I think people in the UK think that we've been punished in lots of petty ways. For example, if you come to Europe, to the UK, then you go through the same passport line as the Brits. This is why when I travel to Europe, I have to use my EU identification card, because I'm also an Irish citizen, as well as a UK citizen. And when the Brits come to European centres, they have to queue up with all of the other nationals. And it's a petty thing like that. Or scientific cooperation. Again, Turkey, Israel, Tunisia are involved in the scientific initiatives, but the UK has been frozen out, despite the fact that it has some of the top universities in the world. The disputes over financial equivalent in the financial services market, and all of the checks on customs in Northern Ireland, which far more customs checks across the Irish border than in the whole of the eastern border of the EU. So many people think that this is just petty-mindedness from Brussels. We've had a number of benefits from Brexit. Our vaccine rollout has been very much quicker. We have more independence on energy policy, which has been very useful in the last year or two. We do have control of our borders. I can no longer use my ID card in order to get into the UK, because the UK government thinks that they're not very secure. So we've been able to do things like that. Control of North Sea fishing, which was a big issue. And of course, Parliament has much more sovereignty. We've been able to introduce free ports and investment zones and take a much more pro-innovation approach to new technologies such as artificial intelligence, whereas the EU is much more restrictive and precautionary. And improve our regulation in other ways. We have a seat at the World Trade Organization, and I think the latest development, our joining of CPTPP, it may not do very much for our economic growth and our trade, but it's an indication that we are looking in the UK more to the rest of the world, not to a Europe which isn't growing very fast, but to other parts of the world which are growing much more quickly, and we'd like to be aligned with that. So I think the lessons for the leavers is that we must listen to the people, not the elites, expect Brussels to be pretty intransigent, and I think we should have been willing to accept a no deal and just say, no, we're not going to accept all of these trivial conditions that you're trying to put on us. And I think we have to capture the gains very quickly. Pierre asked me to talk about Liz Truss. I'm very happy to do that. Again, I think the Conservative Party has been racked with these divisions for an awful long time, and you see that in the selection of the candidates for the party leader and prime minister. And Boris, of course, was very strong on the Leave campaign. And a lot of people didn't like that. So a lot of people in the Conservative Party tried to work out how to get rid of him. And then he was eventually replaced by Liz Truss. And once again, it was the backbenchers in the Conservative Party who were her worst enemy because they are very concerned about this, the Brexit and so on, and they think or many of them think that we should return. So it's a very difficult situation. She did, of course, introduce a budget which cut taxes, and of course everybody says, well, that's the reason why she was forced out of office, because she cut taxes too much. But there was also a £60 billion bailout for families to help with their energy bills. So you cut taxes on the one hand, and then you spend like mad on the other. Clearly the books didn't add up. So I think that she should have got, if she was going to get criticised, it should have been for raising public expenditure to an eye-watering amount, rather than cutting taxes, which is exactly what we need to do now, that we are facing a recession and very large debt, and really we need to kickstart growth. So that's all I have to say. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you. Thank you.
So, if I may say something, we are sad that you left, because we kind of saw, it looks like Brussels is getting increasingly mad recently at regulating, and we're wondering whether this madness is not due to the fact that there is no longer British countervailing force in Brussels, but at the same time, you're free. Everyone should be liable.
Can I just say on that? Yes, I think you're right that without Britain, there is a bigger problem. On the good side, I think that countries who have previously hidden behind Britain and let us take all of the criticism and the barrage, the flak. That now they are having to stand up for themselves and coming forward. So I think that's a good thing.
Right. So.
As you mentioned, there was a fracture between the right and the common people in England for the referendum. Does this fracture still stand in England, or does the elite of the country now embrace that there is a Brexit and there is no coming back to the EU for a long time?
Well, there is still that division. For example, the House of Lords, which is as elitist as you can get, we have introduced a bill in Parliament that will allow us to release ourselves from European regulation. When we left, we accepted the European regulations, said we wouldn't change it for a certain time in order to ease the transition. And so there is a bill which is empowering the British government to drop European regulations or change European regulations. The House of Lords is threatening to block that legislation. So there you have an elite which is blocking the legislation. The ordinary people, I think, are less keen on the Brexit idea, but not because they think Brexit's a bad thing, but because we haven't actually made very much progress on it. Yes, we've negotiated some trade deals, and all the other benefits which I said, the COVID rollout and so on. But that doesn't impact on most people. So they're sort of more skeptical. But the civil service and many of the politicians, it's not a left and right thing. It's very strange. But these divisions are still running very deeply. And it wouldn't surprise me if we had a Labour government, the Conservatives are doing very badly, there's an election next year. If we had a Labour government, they might try to align themselves more with European Union systems. And there would be an argument, well, we're so closely aligned, let's go back in. But I hope it doesn't happen.
But do you think that there would be another referendum in that case? They cannot go back to the EU themselves?
Well, traditionally we've gone in and accepted Maastricht and things without any referendum. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Parliament is sovereign. It can do what it likes. If anybody like to ask me about Liz Truss or anything, I'm happy to do that.
I have a question and a remark. The question is, do you have more freedom after Brexit? And the remark is about your sentence and the opposition between elite and people. In fact, the elite are in the people. It's the same thing. And can you define more precisely what is an elite?
Well, do we have more freedom? Yes, undoubtedly we do. We have more freedom to decide our own laws and to decide new regulations and more freedom to trade. And we are a great trading nation. We have more freedom to set our own policies. So there is those sorts of things. In terms of individual liberty, I don't think very much has changed. I think it probably will change, and it will get more liberal the further that we get from the EU ways of doing things. In terms of the division of the elites and the people, well, yes, I accept your point. What I'm saying is that people in authority of any sort, civil servants, ministers, officials, leading newspapers, The Times, The Guardian, The Economist. In fact, after the referendum, I went to the Economist Christmas party, and the speeches there were all about how could the British people be so stupid? You know, we've really failed because they should know by now that we should have remained in the EU. And I thought, I was just horrified by this. I thought, no, if the people have decided that we shouldn't be in, then we hold a referendum because we want to know what the people think, and that's what they thought. So we should respect those views rather than criticise them as being stupid, because the great British public are not stupid. They can see very well what's happening in their own lives. So that really is the division. It's the division between people who are in power and authority and those who feel, it's the silent majority, who feel that they don't really have any say over these things at all. The people in the pub. That's where you find out what Britain is really thinking. Sir.
Would you agree that the UK has become terribly woke, and what can the consequence for free market thinking be?
I thought the whole world had become terribly woke, has it not? The whole world has become terribly woke. Well, these things start in America, and then because of the language and so on, they gravitate pretty quickly to the UK. But I think that things have started to change. I think we've seen the high water mark because people are now saying, well, a lot of this woke policy is just silly. It's just, against common sense. For example, sports, athletics and rugby had a big debate about whether trans people should be able to play in women's teams and so on. And the woke line is, well, yes, of course they should. Trans woman is a woman. Whereas many of the sportswomen in particular object to this very strongly, because they say, look, even if they are now women, they're still much, much bigger and stronger than the average woman. So this is not a fair competition. And rugby and athletics have now ruled that if you were a male gender at puberty, then you cannot compete in women's sport. And people are hailing that as being, well, that's common sense. It's not that we have anything against trans people. It's just that it does lead to some problems which we should recognize. And instead of just taking it as an ideology, we should recognize that this causes difficulties. So let's make sure that we solve those difficulties. So I think the wokery high watermark has gone, actually. I think we're getting more sensible.
But the relations between races are, for example,
That's yes.
very much a subject for the war.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
And what can be the consequences for free market thinking
Oh.
of this approach?
Well, dreadful, awful is the answer to that. It's a great disappointment to me. In the UK, we have a very diverse culture, and we get people from all over the world, and London is an incredibly cosmopolitan city. And I think people were just getting to the stage where, like Martin Luther King said, we should judge people on their character, not their colour. And I think we were getting to that situation. And yet now we have to treat people as members of individual groups. And we reduce them to individual groups. We don't treat them as individuals anymore. And I think a very large part of that problem is the fact that government is so invasive, and that ordinary people live and let live. They don't mind. They don't mind who you are as long as you treat them fairly and so on. They don't care where you come from, what your religion is, or what your race is, and so on. But if you're government and you're spending money, then you have to say, oh, well, I think we should spend it on this group and that group and this group here. And then you're automatically putting people in these categories instead of treating them like individuals. And I think it's the public spending, it's the schools and universities and things. That's where so much of this is being perpetuated by people who don't really understand what they're doing. So.
Do you think that it's important that the UK becomes a kind of Singapore thing in terms of finance and investment?
Well, I think the Singapore on Thames analogy has been greatly exaggerated, because Singapore, has some pretty tough rules. It's not a laissez-faire paradise. But yes, I think that the role for Britain in financial services is as an innovator, and we are, in this part of the world, the major international financial centre. I mean, there are lots of regional centres around Europe, but Britain has a sort of unique international role, and particularly with its connections to the United States and so on. So I think we're an innovator, and I think we do want to set our own rules, and we think that we're pretty confident that we can build a financial sector that people trust because it's well regulated, but it's not over-regulated. So I think that's the way forward. I think it's good to have competition in the different ways that people regulate their industries and their financial services, and then you can see which ones are working and which ones aren't. I much prefer diversity to everybody doing the same thing, because if everybody does the same thing and there's a problem, then everybody suffers. Whereas if you're having different rules in different places, well, you can see if there's a problem there, we don't have to repeat it here. I hope that. Well, we agree voluntarily to a certain number of international rules, of course. But I think beyond that, we'd prefer to make our own rather than to follow what people on the continent think is right for them. We value that diversity, we value that freedom and independence. And actually, London has been built up over many decades, indeed centuries, precisely because we did have that independence and we could set our own rules, because we can work out what works and what doesn't. Okay. Thank you very much.
On va maintenant passer au prochain talk avec Yorick de Mombynes. Donc pour ceux qui ne le connaissent pas encore, Yorick est conseiller référendaire à la Cour des comptes et il s'exprime, il est très très présent dans les débats publics relatifs aux questions sur Bitcoin en particulier et les crypto-monnaies. Vous n'avez pas besoin de présentation.
I proposed to do my talk in English, but I was told that my English is too awful, so I will continue in French. Ravi d'être avec vous pour parler ce soir de Bitcoin. Mon sujet est Bitcoin et la liberté. Alors je ne sais pas ce que vous en pensez, mais mon impression c'est que malgré ses défauts, ses limitations, ses tares, ses dangers innombrables, réel ou supposé, le Bitcoin, l'invention du Bitcoin et l'essor de Bitcoin est probablement l'événement ou le phénomène libéral majeur de notre époque. Le phénomène en faveur de la liberté le plus important depuis la chute de l'URSS. On ne peut pas dire qu'il est réussi, on ne sait pas s'il est en train de réussir. En revanche, il est de plus en plus imprudent de dire qu'il va échouer. À mesure que le temps passe, cette affirmation devient de moins en moins crédible. S'agissant de la liberté, elle est malmenée. Je pense que la liberté va très mal dans le monde, les perspectives sont inquiétantes. Et au cœur de ce phénomène, il y a la monnaie. Le régime monétaire explique une grande partie de l'effondrement de la liberté. Et donc si on arrive à transformer la monnaie, on peut ressusciter le projet libéral. Et donc, de ce point de vue-là, moi j'estime que Bitcoin est une des rares raisons de garder espoir, malgré l'effondrement généralisé de la liberté. Et donc, si cette hypothèse est correcte, il serait extrêmement dommage pour les libéraux de passer à côté de ce sujet du Bitcoin. Et de faire que leur engagement en faveur de la liberté, finalement, passerait à côté de la principale avancée en faveur de la liberté de notre époque. Donc, c'est cette hypothèse que je voudrais tester avec vous en 3 temps. Je vais passer rapidement sur les 2 premiers, puisque je pense qu'ils sont relativement consensuels parmi les libéraux. J'essaierai de passer un peu plus de temps sur le 3e. Premièrement, je vais résumer pourquoi la liberté va mal et pourquoi ça va aller de plus en plus mal. Deuxièmement, pourquoi la monnaie est au cœur de ce phénomène. Et troisièmement, Bitcoin, qu'est-ce que c'est et comment ça règle une partie de ces problèmes. Alors, d'abord, la liberté va mal. Il y a un relatif consensus parmi les libéraux là-dessus, mais je vais passer assez vite dessus. Bon, les démocraties sont en train de s'effondrer dans le clientélisme, la démagogie, le populisme. La propriété privée, qui est l'institution centrale de la liberté, est totalement bafouée, rognée, limitée de toutes parts. Elle n'a pratiquement plus aucun sens. La liberté d'opinion est maintenant niée, considérée comme dangereuse. Les faux droits pullulent partout. Donc il y a un problème de philosophie politique. On ne sait plus ce que c'est qu'un droit, un vrai droit. Les ennemis de la société ouverte sont partout. Société ouverte au sens de Popper. L'islamisme, les écolos fanatiques, le wokisme qui est une véritable vague totalitaire. Les 2 dernières années Covid qui viennent de passer nous ont montré de manière sidérante l'effondrement des libertés qui est possible et qui était inimaginable quelques mois avant ce phénomène. Et puis, on assiste même, alors que les libéraux devraient s'ériger contre toutes ces tendances, à un fourvoiement de certains libéraux qui appuient des mesures socialistes comme le revenu universel. Par ailleurs, le capitalisme est en cours de destruction, l'interventionnisme étatique est généralisé, il n'y a plus aucun domaine de l'activité économique et sociale qui échappe à des monceaux de réglementation, d'encadrement, de régulation, d'autorisation, d'interdiction de plus en plus pointilleuses. Cet interventionnisme distord le fonctionnement de l'économie de marché, produit des problèmes économiques et sociaux, mais qu'on attribue à la liberté, au libéralisme, au capitalisme. Et c'est ce qu'avait montré de manière magistrale Revel il y a 20 ans dans la Grande Parade, l'incroyable parade de la gauche après l'effondrement du bloc socialiste, c'est d'avoir fait croire que tous les problèmes auxquels nous assistons aujourd'hui sont la conséquence du capitalisme. C'est une incroyable parade qui a été réussie par la gauche et dans laquelle nous sommes toujours en ce moment. Et à mesure que les problèmes s'accroissent, il y a une frustration, une colère de la population qui attribue ces désordres à l'excès de liberté et qui demande un surcroît d'autorité et qui justifie des politiques de plus en plus autoritaires. Autrement dit, la liberté est en train de s'effondrer de cette manière et ça ressemble furieusement au scénario décrit par Hayek dans La route de la servitude en 1945. Alors, la monnaie est au cœur d'une partie de ces problèmes. Pas tous, mais une partie. Donc, c'est mon deuxième point. Au cours des siècles, il y a eu une emprise croissante de la puissance publique sur l'institution de la monnaie, et il y a eu une accélération foudroyante de cette évolution au XXe siècle, en 2 étapes. 1914, chute de l'étalon or, et 1971, sortie de l'étalon de change or. Et aujourd'hui, donc, la puissance publique a toujours le monopole de l'émission monétaire, même s'il est délégué en partie aux banques commerciales. Et nous sommes dans un régime de monnaie fiat qui est, par essence, inflationniste, puisque c'est sa raison d'être, c'est de permettre une création monétaire supérieure à celle qui aurait lieu dans un régime de monnaie différent. Pourquoi ? Pour financer la sphère publique. Et donc, on se retrouve avec une sphère publique obèse, omniprésente, tentaculaire, qui a des moyens de financement illimités grâce à un coût du crédit rabaissé artificiellement par la création monétaire. Et donc la puissance publique se trouve avec un surcroît de pouvoir. Elle peut intervenir partout. Elle peut financer des groupes d'intérêt, elle peut financer de la propagande, tous azimuts, par l'éducation, les médias, la culture. Elle peut façonner les esprits à sa guise, dans son sens. Et puis, ce régime de monnaie fiat, il perturbe l'économie. Les Autrichiens ont très bien montré qu'il était à l'origine des cycles économiques. Et puis, évidemment, il distord le système des prix qui est le système d'information de l'économie de marché. Les prix n'ont plus aucun sens quand l'émission de la monnaie est imprévisible, erratique, arbitraire, inflationniste. Et donc, ça perturbe le fonctionnement de l'économie de marché, mais ça disloque aussi la société, le tissu social. D'abord à travers l'effet Cantillon, puisque la politique monétaire expansionniste engendre des redistributions de pouvoir d'achat relatifs en faveur des possesseurs d'actifs, au détriment des gens qui ne possèdent pas d'actifs. La politique monétaire inflationniste engendre aussi, accroît la démagogie et le clientélisme, puisqu'elle finance une manne monétaire, une manne qui va faire l'objet de distribution par la puissance publique aux citoyens et aux électeurs. Et donc il y a une sorte de surenchère dans les promesses les plus démagogiques pour attirer des votes qu'on peut acheter avec cette manne financière. Ensuite, on se retrouve avec une sorte de monnaie fondante finalement. La monnaie se déprécie au cours du temps. Il suffit de voir le pouvoir d'achat réel du dollar depuis un siècle. C'est un effondrement littéral. Donc cette monnaie fondante, c'est une atteinte directe à l'institution de la propriété privée. C'est une spoliation, une expropriation. C'est une destruction de l'institution de la propriété privée. Et puis enfin, toutes ces politiques sont faites de manière très peu démocratique. Il n'y a jamais de débat dans les élections nationales ou autres sur ces sujets, jamais. Et les autorités de la sphère publique en charge de ces sujets sont complètement irresponsables d'un point de vue politique et démocratique. Donc il y a une perversion de la démocratie. Donc quand on est attaché à la démocratie, on devrait s'ériger contre ce régime monétaire. Et tous ces problèmes engendrent une frustration, une colère de la population contre le capitalisme, contre les élites, alors qu'en fait, ces problèmes viennent du régime monétaire et du capitalisme de connivence, qui n'a rien à voir avec le capitalisme. Alors quelles sont les perspectives ? Elles sont très inquiétantes. Les dettes publiques ont atteint des niveaux inimaginables, elles sont insoutenables, donc on va devoir, pour les traiter, adopter un cocktail de défauts, d'augmentation d'impôts, de baisse de dépenses radicales et de dépréciation de la monnaie. Et tout ça ne va pas se faire pacifiquement. Ça va entraîner une résistance de la population, ça va être très douloureux. Et donc, pour mettre en œuvre ces politiques, qu'est-ce qu'il va falloir ? Un surcroît d'autorité, d'autoritarisme et de réduction des libertés. D'autant plus qu'on va progressivement mettre en place un outil clé pour développer ces politiques, qui vont être les monnaies numériques de banque centrale, des outils potentiellement totalitaires. Toutes les banques centrales en rêvent, y réfléchissent, les expérimentent. Dans l'indifférence générale, il y a des obstacles sérieux parce que ça va quand même compliquer le travail des banques. Et les banques centrales sont prudentes, elles y vont quand même de manière progressive, rassurante, etc. Mais le mouvement est lancé. Le mouvement est lancé. Donc, pour résumer ces deux premières parties, il y a un effondrement de la liberté. La monnaie est au cœur de cette évolution. Et la monnaie va aussi être un instrument d'asservissement croissant si les monnaies numériques de banque centrale sont mises en place. Donc la réforme de la monnaie et du régime monétaire est un enjeu central. Tous les libéraux devraient s'en saisir. Alors, troisièmement, le Bitcoin. Supposons que soit inventé par miracle un instrument monétaire qui permette de répondre aux problèmes que j'ai décrits. Est-ce qu'on peut penser que les États vont laisser faire ? Est-ce qu'on peut penser que cette évolution, l'arrivée d'une nouvelle monnaie, va se faire rapidement et qu'en quelques années, on va changer de monnaie dans le monde entier ? Non, non. Non à ces deux questions. Ça va forcément être très progressif et ça va forcément engendrer une résistance déterminée de tous les États. Donc, résistance qui va prendre quelle forme ? D'abord des tentatives d'interdiction. Et puis ensuite, pour le cas où ce ne serait pas possible de détruire cette nouvelle forme de monnaie malgré l'interdiction, eh bien, qu'est-ce que feraient les États ? Ils auraient un intérêt objectif à diffuser tous les clichés, tous les préjugés, tous les poncifs, toutes les désinformations les plus outrancières pour freiner l'évolution de cette nouvelle forme de monnaie. Par exemple, il pourrait dire que ça n'est pas une monnaie, qu'elle est volatile, qu'elle ne repose sur rien, qu'elle pollue, qu'elle favorise les méchants, qu'elle va déstabiliser le système financier. En fait, tous les arguments seraient bons à prendre. Et c'est exactement ce qu'on voit avec Bitcoin. Bitcoin est une occasion inespérée de transformer radicalement le système monétaire sans l'avis des États, sans qu'on ait besoin des États pour le faire. Alors, je vais résumer d'abord ce que c'est que Bitcoin. Ça n'est pas une monnaie. Bitcoin n'est pas une monnaie. Une monnaie, c'est un instrument d'échange, un moyen d'échange universel, un pouvoir d'achat généralisé, comme dit Pascal Salin, et Bitcoin n'est pas ça. Il n'est pas encore ça. Qu'est-ce que Bitcoin? C'est un dispositif informatique qui permet de l'échange de valeurs sur Internet de manière dématérialisée, désintermédiée, sans tiers de confiance, de manière incensurable, de manière programmable, de manière rapide et de manière relativement anonyme. C'est ça Bitcoin. Ça n'est pas une monnaie. C'est un système de paiement, un système de transfert de valeur, une infrastructure de paiement. Ça n'est pas une infrastructure monétaire. C'est pas tout à fait la même chose. Mais c'est une monnaie en devenir. Pourquoi? Parce que le jeton numérique et comptable qui sert à transférer de la valeur sur cette infrastructure a les qualités objectives pour être utilisé comme une monnaie. Ces qualités, c'est quoi? C'est celles qu'on connaît en théorie et en histoire monétaire depuis toujours. Homogénéité, divisibilité, portabilité, résistance aux attaques, donc non pas attaque physique, mais la attaque informatique, et rareté relative, difficulté à produire. Toutes ces qualités objectives que les métaux précieux avaient et qui ont fait qu'ils ont été adoptés progressivement par l'ordre spontané du marché au cours des millénaires, Bitcoin les a. Simplement, la reconnaissance de ce fait ne peut pas être instantanée. Ça peut prendre plusieurs générations. C'est normal. Donc, le fait de respecter les 3 fonctions aristotéliciennes de la monnaie, moyen d'échange, unité de compte, réserve de valeur, ne peut pas être instantané. C'est progressif et c'est ce qui se passe en ce moment. Bitcoin, progressivement, remplit ses fonctions, mais très lentement. Et donc, impossible de savoir combien de temps ça va durer, cette évolution. Mais en tout cas, cette évolution est là. C'est une monnaie en devenir. Alors, si on regarde ce qu'ont dit les grands théoriciens libéraux sur la monnaie au XXe siècle, on peut dire que d'une certaine manière, Bitcoin répond à leur principale préconisation, même quand ils n'étaient pas d'accord entre eux. Prenons les 3 des principaux, Hayek, Friedman et Rothbard. Bitcoin instaure de facto une compétition, une concurrence entre les monnaies, même si on n'a pas levé le monopole de l'émission monétaire, comme le préconisait Hayek dans son livre « Denationalization of Money ». Et Bitcoin est aussi une dénationalisation de la monnaie, au sens où ça n'est plus une monnaie liée à une nation. Ensuite, Friedman préconisait une augmentation prévisible de la masse monétaire. Bitcoin a une augmentation prévisible de sa masse monétaire. Elle est inscrite dans le code, elle est non modifiable, c'est un paramètre clé qui ne sera jamais modifié. Ce régime d'émission est désinflationniste, puisque le nombre de bitcoins émis toutes les 10 minutes est divisé par 2 tous les 4 ans, et donc il peut donner lieu à une économie déflationniste si Bitcoin devient une monnaie généralisée. Et puis, Rothbard préconisait un retour à l'étalon or, c'est-à-dire à une commodity monnaie, une monnaie assise sur un bien réel. Et Bitcoin est une commodity money. C'est le fameux débat sur la valeur non monétaire, l'usage non monétaire ou la valeur intrinsèque du Bitcoin. Qu'est-ce que c'est la valeur intrinsèque du Bitcoin? C'est son infrastructure de paiement. C'est une infrastructure de paiement. Et simplement, c'est tellement nouveau conceptuellement que on va mettre plusieurs générations à le comprendre. C'est normal. Ce sont les mystères de l'ère numérique. Elle ne s'impose pas immédiatement. En même temps, c'est une ère où tout va plus vite qu'avant. C'est-à-dire que voir une monnaie s'imposer, atteindre le niveau de développement que Bitcoin a aujourd'hui en juste quelques années, c'est inouï en soi. C'est totalement prodigieux. Alors, pourquoi Bitcoin peut finalement protéger la liberté? De 2 manières principales. D'abord, il est insaisissable. Aujourd'hui, il y a déjà des millions de personnes qui protègent leur épargne et leurs avoirs par le Bitcoin parce qu'ils savent qu'on ne pourra pas leur confisquer dans des régimes autoritaires qui sont soumis au despotisme, à l'arbitraire administratif ou bancaire. Quelqu'un qui possède ses clés privées de Bitcoin, sous quelque forme que ce soit, mais la forme la plus sûre, c'est une liste de mots qu'on retient dans sa tête, c'est non confiscable. C'est totalement nouveau. En fait, c'est la première fois qu'on a ça dans l'histoire de l'humanité, une monnaie non confiscable, insaisissable. C'est un premier moyen de protéger sa liberté en protégeant sa propriété privée. Et puis deuxièmement, c'est une monnaie qui n'est pas manipulable par les États. Elle n'est pas manipulable parce que les États ne peuvent pas modifier son régime d'émission. Donc ça veut dire que on ne peut pas déprécier cette monnaie artificiellement comme les États le font avec les monnaies fiat. Donc là aussi, c'est un moyen de protéger la propriété privée. Et puis, le fait que les États ne puissent pas modifier son régime d'émission fait qu'on se retrouve dans un paradigme nouveau en termes de financement de la puissance publique. Si Bitcoin s'impose, les États ne pourront plus financer toutes les dépenses sans limite qui financent aujourd'hui, notamment les guerres les plus inutiles. Donc c'est un changement de civilisation potentiellement. Alors évidemment, on prête à Bitcoin énormément d'inconvénients. Moi, mon impression, c'est que la plupart de ces inconvénients sont soit exagérés, soit totalement mensongers. Exagéré, c'est le cas de la volatilité. C'est un inconvénient qui est réel, évident, mais qui est normal, qui est logique dans la phase de transition actuelle. On ne peut pas inventer une monnaie ex nihilo qui soit stable immédiatement. C'est complètement absurde de penser ça. Donc c'est absurde de reprocher au Bitcoin qu'il soit volatile. La question c'est, est-ce qu'il y a une chance de devenir moins volatile avec le temps ? Et ce qu'on voit, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, son adoption progresse malgré cet inconvénient. Et donc il faut faire un effort pour imaginer où ça nous mènerait si l'adoption continuait à progresser malgré cet inconvénient. Et si elle progresse, et là personne ne peut être certain qu'elle va continuer à progresser, mais si elle progresse, ça veut dire que la part relative de la market cap du Bitcoin dans les marchés financiers mondiaux va augmenter. Donc le jeton Bitcoin, le cours du Bitcoin sera moins vulnérable à des chocs de demande positifs ou négatifs externes. C'est mécanique. Et les autres inconvénients, évidemment, bon là on pourrait en parler très longtemps, mais malheureusement je n'ai pas le temps de le faire. Il y a des modes. Donc aujourd'hui la mode c'est Bitcoin est vilain pour l'environnement, parce qu'il est très énergivore et très polluant. Deux notions différentes déjà. Personnellement, ça ne me pose aucun problème qu'il soit énergivore, j'espère même qu'il va devenir de plus en plus énergivore. Parce que plus il est énergivore et plus il est sécurisé. Et de l'énergie, il y en a sans limite dans l'univers, notamment sur Terre. Le sujet, c'est mettre en place l'innovation technologique et les institutions économiques permettant d'exploiter cette énergie. Donc ça, c'est l'inverse de la vision malthusienne qui est prédominante aujourd'hui, consistant à dire il faut vous empêcher de consommer de l'énergie par la force, par la coercition. C'est le seul moyen de régler notre problème. Et puis l'aspect environnemental, pollution, en fait, là, c'est complètement absurde. Les faits montrent que Bitcoin, en fait, il est rationnel économiquement pour les mineurs d'utiliser en priorité des énergies renouvelables parce que, en général, ce sont celles qui sont les moins chères. Elles sont produites dans des endroits où il n'y a pas de demande industrielle. Et donc, le minage de Bitcoin arrive même à rendre rentables des unités de production d'énergie renouvelable. Donc évidemment, il y a plein d'autres cryptos aussi, hein. Il y en a des milliers maintenant, mais on est dans un domaine où il y a un avantage au premier entrant. La monnaie est un des sujets sur lesquels les externalités de réseau sont les plus forts, et puis surtout, on est dans le domaine qui est psychologiquement et culturellement différent de ce qu'on voit avec les services des GAFA. C'est le domaine de la confiance dans un instrument dans lequel on va mettre ses économies. Donc on ne peut pas changer d'avis immédiatement quand on a mis ses économies ou quand on veut mettre ses économies dans une certaine technologie. Contrairement à un moteur de recherche, on peut changer de moteur de recherche du jour au lendemain sans coût, sans effort. Donc là, les gens qui placent leur argent dans les crypto-monnaies vont d'abord s'assurer que ces cryptos sont bien sécurisés. Et ils vont le faire en se renseignant ou en écoutant des gens qui se sont renseignés. Et puis, il y a en fait une confiance qui s'accumule avec le temps. Et les crypto-monnaies qui inspirent le plus confiance, c'est celles qui ont été le plus attaquées, d'un point de vue informatique, dans le temps. Et d'un point de vue politique aussi. Donc, il y a un avantage au premier entrant dans ce domaine-là, contrairement aux autres domaines de la technologie qu'on a connus ces 30 dernières années. Donc, malgré la concurrence féroce des autres cryptos, qui ont des paramètres techniques et économiques différents, Bitcoin est toujours la première crypto, et on peut imaginer qu'à moins d'une rupture majeure ou d'un problème historique, il gardera cette position. Donc finalement, le match du siècle qu'on va observer dans les années qui viennent, ça va plutôt être le match entre le Bitcoin et les monnaies numériques de banque centrale. C'est-à-dire que quand vous aurez le choix entre une monnaie de banque centrale numérique que les autorités peuvent manipuler à leur guise, dont elles peuvent diminuer le solde sur votre compte pour tous les motifs qu'elles voudront, les motifs les plus vertueux, écologique, lutte contre le terrorisme, relance keynésienne de la consommation, etc. Et puis par ailleurs, une monnaie qu'elles pourront observer dans les moindres détails, pister tous vos comportements d'achat. Donc quand vous aurez le choix entre cette monnaie-là et une monnaie qui préserve votre patrimoine, qui est non confiscable et qui est difficilement observable, en fait, vous n'hésiterez pas très longtemps. Donc les MNBC vont être un incroyable coup de publicité pour le Bitcoin, progressivement. C'est ce qu'on peut imaginer. Alors, en conclusion, il y a beaucoup de raisons d'être inquiet pour la liberté. Un des atouts des libéraux est d'avoir identifié une des causes profondes et complexes de l'effondrement de la liberté au XXe siècle, c'est la manipulation de la monnaie par les États. Transformer la monnaie, c'est se donner la possibilité de régénérer le projet libéral qui est complètement, effondré. À part Bitcoin, qu'est-ce qu'on a comme autre solution pour transformer la monnaie et le régime monétaire? Est-ce qu'on peut croire que ce sont les États volontairement, gracieusement, docilement, qui vont scier la branche sur laquelle ils sont installés grâce au monopole de la monnaie et à la monnaie fiat? Évidemment non. Donc, donc je ne vois pas très bien ce qu'il y a comme autre espoir que Bitcoin. Et si Bitcoin échoue, on est dans une situation extrêmement préoccupante parce qu'on n'aura rien d'autre. On ne va pas recréer une crypto-monnaie à partir de rien qui serait au moins aussi performante que Bitcoin. Ça n'est pas possible, parce que quand Bitcoin est né et s'est développé, il était très vulnérable dans les premières années, mais il échappait au regard des États. Mais cette situation est définitivement révolue. Aucune autre nouvelle crypto-monnaie vraiment dangereuse pour les États ne peut émerger sans être immédiatement identifiée par les États et donc prenant le risque d'être torpillée ou manipulée par les États. Donc Bitcoin est une solution qui n'est pas reproductible. Et donc on a intérêt à comprendre Bitcoin et à le promouvoir, ou si on refuse de le faire, eh bien à promouvoir une autre solution monétaire encore plus efficace. Mais honnêtement, je n'en vois pas dans la pensée libérale contemporaine. Merci. Je ne sais pas si on a le temps pour quelques questions ou si tout le monde est épuisé et attend la pause. La monnaie, Hayek, il suggère que les États lèvent le monopole de l'émission monétaire. Et donc, est-ce qu'on peut raisonnablement penser que les États vont accepter de faire ça? Peut-être qu'ils le feront en dernière extrémité quand ils n'auront plus le choix. Et en général, c'est comme ça que ça se passe. Les États freinent face au réel le plus longtemps possible, les déséquilibres s'accroissent, et puis ensuite, il y a une crise majeure, un effondrement, et là, il y a une vraie réforme intelligente. Mais sinon, je ne vois pas très bien comment ça pourrait avoir lieu.
Vous avez parlé de consommation énergétique du Bitcoin, donc c'est le proof of work. C'est le débat entre proof of stake et proof of work. Et il s'est de passer au proof of stake. Est-ce qu'il y a une chance que Bitcoin fasse la même transition à un moment ou à un autre?
Donc le débat proof of work, proof of stake, Ethereum est passé au proof of stake, c'est une méthode de validation différente, qui est moins énergivore, et donc qui est à la mode. Elle est vertueuse. En fait, pour l'instant, il n'y a aucune chance pour que Bitcoin change de méthode, parce que ça fait partie des piliers de son dispositif, et on est dans un domaine où la confiance s'accumule avec le temps. Donc en fait, Bitcoin est un dispositif très conservateur, parce qu'il s'agit d'accumuler de la confiance et de ne pas créer des nouveaux risques. Et puis, Ethereum, en fait, a remis les compteurs à zéro en termes de confiance accumulée avec le temps, avec un changement de méthode aussi radical. Il y a un débat parmi les experts, les cryptographes, les informaticiens, sur les compromis en termes de sécurité qu'il y a en passant en proof of stake. C'est pas si évident aujourd'hui que le proof of stake permette un niveau de sécurité aussi rassurant que Bitcoin. Et parfois, c'est même assumé par les partisans des autres cryptos qui sont en proof of stake, qui disent nous, notre objectif, c'est pas de faire un système monétaire mondial, c'est de faire nos innovations technologiques pour certains services spécifiques. On n'a pas besoin d'un niveau de sécurité aussi élevé que Bitcoin. Mais pour l'instant, côté Bitcoin, c'est absolument pas à l'ordre du jour. Les exchanges, vous voulez dire, c'est ça? Vous voulez parler des exchanges, les plateformes d'échange? Voilà. C'est très juste, il y a un risque de confiscation des bitcoins quand on stocke ces bitcoins d'une certaine manière. Quand on est un peu trop négligent, quand on n'a pas envie de faire l'effort de détenir soi-même ces bitcoins, qu'on les laisse sur une plateforme d'échange ou qu'on n'utilise pas les bons wallets sur son téléphone. Donc ce risque existe. Et donc en ce moment, on est dans une phase de transition où la culture de la protection de ces clés privées n'est en fait pas encore très ancrée, ce qui est normal. Donc la question, c'est est-ce que les choses vont évoluer? Donc c'est un sujet culturel et puis c'est aussi un sujet technologique parce que les entrepreneurs sont là pour inventer des solutions de plus en plus performantes, de plus en plus accessibles pour le public. Donc là, il y a une dynamique. Et en fait, moi, j'ai l'impression que la dynamique est plutôt positive globalement. Oui, c'est très juste. Le meilleur moyen de tuer Bitcoin, c'est que les États reviennent à des monnaies saines. C'est ce que dit Seyfeddin Ammous dans son livre de référence sur le Bitcoin, l'étalon Bitcoin. Donc il suffirait que tous les États se décident à redevenir raisonnables d'un point de vue monétaire et à réformer le système monétaire pour avoir des monnaies saines. Mais en fait, la probabilité pour que ça arrive est microscopique, parce que ce serait un traumatisme que les États s'infligeraient à eux-mêmes. Ça couperait leurs moyens de production de manière drastique, de leurs moyens de financement de manière drastique. Aujourd'hui, ils ont un besoin vital de la planche à billets au sens métaphorique. Vital. C'est pour ça que Bitcoin est un traumatisme absolu pour eux. Donc voilà, ce risque est théoriquement envisageable, mais sa probabilité est quasi nulle. Ça dépend un peu du rythme du temps de la transition. Bon, si on suppose que ça prendra plusieurs générations, ça veut dire que ce sera une contrainte externe qui va obliger les États à se réformer de manière radicale. Et en fait à devenir beaucoup plus petits, moins interventionnistes, plus raisonnables, plus respectueux de la propriété privée et des libertés. Donc c'est un scénario un peu idyllique. C'est presque difficile d'y croire en fait. C'est presque inespéré. C'est une forme d'utopie. Mais c'est une utopie réaliste. Et c'est pas une utopie qui nécessite de massacrer la moitié de la population, comme les utopies de gauche. Merci.
On va faire une petite pause jusqu'à 20h. We're going to take a small break until 8 p.m. So I guess we have only 15 minutes. On a seulement un quart d'heure. Voilà, n'hésitez pas à discuter avec toute l'équipe de l'IREF est au complet. N'hésitez pas à discuter aussi avec les intervenants. On a des ouvrages à vous distribuer gratuitement juste au fond de la salle. Donc voilà, à tout de suite.
Craig doesn't have a presentation.
He doesn't have any?
No, he doesn't.
Oh, okay, okay.
Um, just open it.
This one?
Yeah. Yeah.
So can I give it back to you? If you, it will not shut down if I give it.
Yeah, but you have to delete it afterwards because I have data from central bank that I should not publicly.
Okay.
Or like, you know. Is this a PDF or
wait.
is this a
I have an idea. Wait. What I will do?
Yeah,
Yes, I will just download it.
yeah, exactly. And then you can
More secure and
and then
give it back to you. Continue.
oh,
Okay.
that's beautiful. What is that?
French. That's somewhere in the French hall.
Let me see.
Please. Test. J'essaie de baisser le volume parce qu'apparemment il y avait un problème d'acouphène tout à l'heure. C'est allé un peu fort. Ok. Oui, alors je ne sais pas trop comment ça fonctionne, mais bon, ça devrait aller mieux. Okay, so for the next talk, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Eamonn Butler. Oh, wait, sorry. I just got wrong with the paper. Craig Biddle, sorry. So Craig Biddle is the co-founder and executive director of the Objective Standard Institute. He's also co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Objective Standard and executive director of the Prometheus Foundation. So this talk will be about how to make a moral case for liberty. And you don't have any, you don't need any presentation?
Nope.
Perfect, okay.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. Oh, this is wired. Okay, so I need to be here. All right, so you all have heard, no doubt, many times, the economic argument for liberty and the historic argument for liberty. They're kind of one and the same, really. And the idea is that when societies are free, it enables people to think and produce and trade in great measure, and the societies become more wealthy. And every year, the Wall Street Journal and Fraser Institute and several other organizations measure economic progress, economic wealth all over the world. And what they find year in and year out is that, sure enough, the freer a country is, the freer a nation is, the more prosperous its people are. And this is an unassailable argument. I mean, everyone really paying attention to economics and to freedom and to the world knows that this is the case. But notice that despite the fact that everyone paying attention knows that this is the case, we are still losing liberties in many ways. And I believe strongly that the reason is that if you don't have the moral case for liberty, then you've lost the case for liberty. We need not only the economic and the historic arguments for liberty. They're important. I'm not saying they're not important. They're crucially important because they're one of the things that shows the practicality of freedom on a grand scale, sort of in the aggregate, of course, which is what economics is largely about. But the moral case is something that is equally, if not more important, and it's certainly more fundamental. And I want to make a brief version of that case for you today. And hopefully it will help you to think more deeply and in a more integrative way about this thing we're trying to do. So as soon as you start talking about liberty and someone says, well, liberty is good, or people should be free, you're using moral terminology right there. If it's true that liberty is good, or if it's true that people should be free, we can see that there's a moral aspect here. And this takes us into the question, well, why is it good? Why is it true that people should be free? And of course, the traditional answer to this, and it's a good answer, I think, is that, well, people have rights. There's such thing as a right, which is a moral principle. And the rights, real rights, not the ersatz rights to have goods and services given to you, but the rights to act on your own judgment for your own purposes. So the right to liberty is the right to act on your judgment, free of coercion. The right to property is the right to produce goods and services and to keep the product of your effort so that you can consume it or trade it or do what you like with it. The right to the pursuit of happiness is the right to choose and pursue the goals of your own value, your own choosing, so that you can make your life the way you want it to be. All of these rights, all of the real rights, are rights to freedom of action. You may act on your judgment to produce and keep all verbs. You may act free of coercion, act is the verb. You may pursue the values you want, all verbs. So those are the rights I'm talking about, and these are essentially the rights that the Western world largely recognizes, with a lot of pushback against leftists and socialists who want to implement so-called positive rights. You have a right to goods and services. But I'm going to leave that stuff aside today and just focus on the issue of rights. So the theory is that we have rights, that we have a moral prerogative to act on our judgment and keep our stuff. But is that theory true? How do we know we have rights? Well, here there are three traditional answers to this question. Rights come from God, and we know that we have them because we have faith in whatever the religion is that we have faith in that says that they come from God. The second one is that rights come from government. Rights are whatever the government says you may do. So if you're in France, the government of France tells you what you may and may not do, and those are your rights. And if you're in the United States, likewise, and if you're in North Korea, likewise. So your rights come from the government. And the third is that rights come from nature. And that one, of course, probably sounds more appealing to a lot of people, but as we're going to see, there are problems with all three of these theories, and that raises a real problem generally for defending liberty, and I want to address that problem. But first, we'll touch on these three. So if rights come from God, or let me put it this way, what do we have to do first? What do we have to prove first to prove that we have rights? Well, the first thing you have to prove is that there's a God. If rights come from God, and you can't prove that there is a God, you certainly can't prove that you have rights that emanate from his will. So regardless of your position on God, you have to recognize that proving that God exists is either impossible or it's a very tall order, take it either way. And so that's just not going to be a good place to base your theory of rights on if you want to get anywhere with it. The idea that rights come from government is really a bastardization of language. It conflates rights and laws. Of course, laws, if a government passes laws and says you may do this or you may not do that, that's a law. But the whole point of rights is that a right is supposed to be something more fundamental than a law. It's supposed to be something that you have a moral prerogative to do regardless of what the government or the collective says you may or may not do. That's the reason we have the concept of rights. It means a different thing than law. So this literally just bastardizes the language and treats laws and rights as the same thing. And this brings us to rights come from nature, which sounds great and would be great if we could prove that rights come from nature. Where are they? out there. If we go looking for them, they're not under a rock. They're not out there anywhere. You're not going to find them out there. If you cut me open, you're not going to find them in here. You find all sorts of organs in there. There's no rights in there. And this is why, for the whole time people have been talking about rights, other people have been mocking the idea of rights. As you know, Jeremy Bentham called the notion of rights nonsense upon stilts. The notion of inalienable rights, rights that are inherent in you somehow. And Alistair MacIntyre said that rights are one with witches and unicorns because there's an equal amount of evidence for all of them. And this is a problem because it's not just Jeremy Bentham and Alistair MacIntyre mocking this stuff. The leftists and socialists and communists love the fact that no one can prove that you have rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if no one can prove you have rights, then they can just say, like we said, rights come from the government. And we'll tell you what you may and may not do. So this is a serious problem. If we don't have the moral case for liberty, we don't have the case for liberty. We can just throw in the towel. It's just a matter of time. Especially when the people claiming that they have a right to take and redistribute our wealth and to tell us how to run our businesses and all of the regulatory apparatuses that are put into effect by the state on the grounds that redistribution or help for others has to be implemented, whether you like it or not. All of that comes from the fact, or is supported by the fact, that we can't prove that we have rights, and they can say that rights basically come from the government. Now, there's a whole lot more that undergirds this. There's the whole morality of altruism. I'm not even going to get into that today, the idea that you are your brother's keeper and all of that. I'm just going to set that aside because that would have to be a whole nother lecture. But the fact of the matter is, if we can't prove that we have a moral prerogative to keep our stuff and to act on our own judgment and to be free from coercion, then we're going to continue to lose this battle. Well, the philosopher Ayn Rand, who I am a big fan of, whether some of you may know that, Rand came up with a completely different approach to rights that's neither of these three. And I'm going to give you just a short version of it here today because I think it's really worth looking into. And if you're intrigued by what I say here, I urge you to read up on it, and I can give you some advice on where to start there. So Rand took a very Aristotelian approach to rights. She said, in effect, what kind of animal are we talking about here? What is man? What is a human being? And when you look into that question, if you peruse human beings and try to get your head around what is it that makes this animal this kind of animal, what you quickly discover is that we are, as Aristotle put it, we are a rational animal, which certainly does not mean that people are always rational. We know that not to be the case, but that's not what it means. What it means is that we have the faculty of reason, which we can use by choice or not. And this is where I believe the concept, where the locus of free will is. It's in the choice to think or not to think. And that's what we get to do. We can use our minds or not. And when we do use our minds, we can do amazing things. Right? We look around, and the reason, our faculty of reason is precisely why we are the special animal on this planet. We are able to do all sorts of things that no other animal can do. And all you have to do is look around. I have to make an argument for that. We have satellites in the sky through which we're streaming this event right now all across the planet. Reason is the thing that enables us to do this. Indeed, reason is our basic means of living. We have other faculties. We have an emotional faculty. It's a very important faculty. It's an automatic it's a faculty that provides automatic psychological reactions to our values. But our emotions don't provide us with knowledge, and they don't tell us what is true and false. Reason does, and that's the reason that we have this capacity to be so creative and to live beautiful human lives, because we have that faculty. So Rand observes this, and she says, well, what is the one thing? Well, let me add one more point here before I move on to that. So reason is not just our means of knowledge. It really is our basic means of living. How is it that a human being lives? If I'm on an island all alone, we can isolate it and make it pretty clear. What do I have to do? I have to use my mind. I have to think and figure out how to produce the values that I'm going to need. Figure out how to maybe make a fishing rod, or with some sticks or whatever, or pick berries and figure out which berries are edible. I don't have instincts. I don't know this automatically like other animals do. I literally have to use my mind to figure it out. And this is true whether you're on an island all alone or whether you're in a society. You have to use your mind to think about what things are, how to put them together, and how to be productive so that you can produce values and then trade them with others. And that's how we all live beautiful lives. So Rand observes all of this, and she says, in effect, well, what is the one thing that can stop human beings from acting on their judgment, from acting on their rational conclusions? And she observes that the only thing that can stop somebody from acting on his judgment, the only way that another person can stop someone from acting on his judgment, is through the use of physical force. If I'm on my island doing my thing and living, and you row up to the island and strap me to a tree, now I can't act on my judgment. I could before, I can't now. I mean, it's just vivid right there at the perceptual level. Well, the same is true in all degrees of force. It doesn't matter what the kind or degree of force, if and to the extent that force is used against a human being, he cannot act on his judgment. If a woman in Afghanistan wants to go out and sell scarves, and the Taliban man comes along and say, you get back in that house, you're not allowed out here, you're breaking Allah's law, get back in that house or we'll beat you to a pulp, she has no alternative to get back in that house and not try to sell the scarves, or she's going to get beaten to a pulp. Right? She cannot act on her judgment. Her judgment was to sell the scarves. And we could multiply examples endlessly. You come back to a more civilized portion of the world, and if you own a business and the regulators come in and tell you how many seats you're going to have in your restaurant, and how close they have to be together, and what kind of food you have to serve, and this, that, and the other, you can't run your business in accordance with your judgment. There's a big difference between that and being strapped to a tree, or being a slave, or being a woman in Afghanistan, I grant you, but they're all on the same slope. Force. Force comes in degrees, and the degrees matter, and that's my point. The degrees matter. All of the degrees are degrees of force, and this is the thing that is contrary to the requirements of human life. So, Rand says, in effect, we need a principle. We need a principle that is a recognition of this fact. And that principle is the principle of individual rights. The principle of individual rights is a recognition. There's an in here part. You know, a lot of people say, oh, it's just made up. Well, there's an in here part. The mind does something. It recognizes. So there's an action going on there when we form and use the concept of rights. But it's recognizing a fact out there in the world. What is that fact? That human beings are a certain kind of animal, and that we live by acting on our rational judgment. And if we can't do that, and to the extent that we can't do it, we cannot live fully as human beings. Now, this is a different argument than the other three arguments, because it's not, well, we know they come from nature, but we know not how. Rand has identified precisely how they come from nature. It's an identification of a fact. It's a recognition of the fact of the kind of animal that we are, and the fact that every single one of us, regardless of where you're born, or the color of your skin, or what your sexual preference is, none of that matters, because if you are a human being, you need to act on your judgment in order to live, and that's what rights grant us. So the shortest way to think of this, and I like this phrase, is that a human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. Right? This is why slavery is wrong. If you think about it, the moral reason that slavery is wrong is because if you put somebody in a cage or force him to do your work for you, he can't live as a human being. Why? Because he's not acting on his own judgment. He's acting on your judgment. It's precisely what that forced relationship is. And that's a horrible, evil thing. And it's a horrible, evil thing in any degree. This is why we have to extricate the initiation of physical force from social relationships and have force relegated only to retaliatory use against those who initiate its use. This really is the basic principle of humanity. It's the basic principle of a civilized society, that a human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. I think we in the liberty movement need this argument badly, because if we continue to argue only on economic and historic grounds, we're going to continue to lose. Let's integrate those crucial arguments with this crucial argument and win this thing wholesale. Now, I urge you, if you're interested in this at all, if this sounds appealing to you, look into Ayn Rand's ideas. You can read her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Her book on ethics has an essay in it titled Man's Rights. That same essay is in her book that's more about economics and politics, titled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So Man's Rights is in both of those books. Collectivized Rights, I believe, is in both of those books. That's another essay that's on this subject that helps you to get your head further around it. And those are the two probably. Oh, and then The Nature of Government, which is in her essay, The Nature of Government, again, in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So the two books I'm talking about right there are simply The Virtue of Selfishness and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And I'll pitch one other thought on this. I wrote an article several years ago titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights, which is a condensation and an elaboration on her theory. So I condensed the theory down to some of its essentials, and then I elaborate and give a bunch of examples. And you can find that just by searching Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights. It'll pop right up at my organization or my journal, The Objective Standard. And you should be able to access that for free. If you can't, send me an email and I'll send you a copy. So anyway, those are my thoughts here. I'd love to take questions on any of this, and I don't know how much time we have left, but we're good? Okay. All right, thank you, and I'll take questions. How would Rand think about the first set of rules to protect each other in an instance of just brute force, just somebody, grabbing you or she didn't speak about that specific context. What she did is she pointed out that force is a concept that basically has to be defined at the base level ostensibly. If you try to define coercion, it's very hard until you finally say, in effect, it's when, I like punch you or take you or strap you to a tree. You have to sort of give examples of what you mean, and then we can form the concept of coercion, which is the initiatory use of force against a human being to force him to act against his will, right, or something to that effect. And what happens in any context where somebody uses coercion against another, sometimes it's just brutal, right? Somebody can just come up and pummel somebody or cut his head off or shoot him in the face or whatever. I mean, there's really brutal looking force. And then there's the subtle force that's not like that. But in both cases, the subtle force would be, for instance, extortion or fraud, or the government coming in and threatening you that if you don't pony up with all of your taxes this year, we're going to shut your business down and lock you up, which is always there. I mean, every time the government politely asks you to do something, it always has a gun behind its back. That's what a government is, force. So when force is used against somebody, whether it's the outright, vivid, most obvious form of force, or whether it's a subtle form of force, what it does in every instance is stop you from being able to act on your judgment. And that is really serious business, because your judgment is your means of living. And if we could get our head around this as a culture, if people really understood this, so many good things would come of it. Because once we know that, we can all then use our minds to be productive. And then by being productive in a specialized society, we get to trade with each other, with other people who are making things that I don't know how to make and don't have any desire to make, but I want to be able to go get and have. Take the iPhone or an automobile or anything, this microphone. I don't know how to make a microphone, but here I am enjoying this thing because somebody knows how to make a microphone. It does this thing. So, and all of this becomes more and more doable if we extricate force completely from social relationships. The places where force is most limited are precisely the places that are the best off economically. But economics always talks in aggregates, and what I want to focus on is not the aggregate, but the individual. You as an individual, and you as an individual, and you as an individual, you need to act on your judgment. And billionaires who build corporations need to act on their judgment. When money is taken from a billionaire because, well, he's got a lot of money, we'll just take it from him because he's got so much. He doesn't need all that money. Who are you to say what money he needs, right? Who are any of us to say what money? He earned it. He may have plans for it. Some of these billionaires have plans to figure out how to create, to create longer lives for us, or enable us to go to other planets and things. That's their business, and when they do it, by the way, they rain values on us too from above. I mean, it's the extent to which we would benefit if we understood the moral case for rights and integrated that with the other cases for rights is massive. So I think I probably went off a little bit. I'm not sure whether I've answered your question. If I didn't, you could elaborate there.
Yeah, so the thing about how to limit the usage of force between ourselves.
How to limit force between yourselves? Well, Rand holds that you have to have a government to do that, because if you don't, you just have gang warfare. So if there's no government and you attack me, and I'm like, whoa, that sucked. I don't want that to happen again. I'm going to be like, hey, Joe, why don't you and I form a little group here? And next time somebody tries to attack one of us, we'll fight him together. And then you go do the same thing, and then he does the same thing, and she does the same thing. And sure enough, soon enough, as Auburn Herbert put it, one of my favorite thinkers, Auburn Herbert, the 19th century British parliamentarian and social thinker, he said that anarchists don't really understand anarchism because they think that anarchism means no government. But there's no such thing as no government, because as soon as you get government out of the way, people have to deal with the fact that some people, as John Locke points out, some people are going to try to lord it over others. Not most people won't. But some will. And because some will, you have to have a protective agency to stop them when they do it. And if you don't have a government, you're going to form your own. And then guess what you have? A government. Any agency that's trying to hold a monopoly of force in a given geographic area is a government. So what we need is governments, but then we need a government. We need to ensure that our governments are limited to what they can do by a constitution that tells the government you may do one thing and one thing only, and that is protect individual rights by banning physical force from social relationships. That's it. And if and when you do anything else, you're violating the Constitution, which means the people can throw the bums out, in effect. And then there, whether you have a parliamentary system or the U.S. system or whatever, there are multiple systems that can protect rights. There's not only one way of doing this, but you've got to have a way to do it. And you've got to have a constitution that tells the government, no, you may not do anything that you choose. You are limited to this one thing. In my view, you need that. So yeah, and if you don't have that, you can't stop force. It's just you and I will be going at it until we die, and then it's over. So, not that we would, but you get the idea. Any other questions? All right. Well, I am happy to take questions after this for a few minutes, and if you want any more information on this or anything else regarding Ayn Rand's philosophy, my organization, Objective Standard Institute, is an educational organization dedicated to teaching people about the importance of philosophy and the principles of Rand's philosophy and other ideas that integrate with that. And my journal, the Objective Standard Journal, has 18 years worth of articles on these subjects that, if you're interested in this stuff, I think you would find quite interesting. So take a look. Thank you.
Okay, so for the last talk of the conference, we are pleased to welcome Barbara Kolm. So Barbara Kolm is the vice president of the Austrian Central Bank, also president of the Hayek Institute, and she's a frequent speaker on public policy-related issues, especially on deregulation, competition, the future of Europe, and Austrian economics.
Well, thank you very much, Elodie. So I will not keep you too much longer, and I have a couple of slides prepared. I don't know, I don't want to depress you, but nonetheless I present facts and figures here. So let's see, where does this move? Yeah, where does this move on? Elodie, where's the clicker? Sorry. Unfortunately, I'm an Apple user, and so where do I have to click?
Here.
Okay. No.
Okay, sorry, it doesn't really work. I just click.
Well, okay, I just tried to be as flexible. I returned from the IMF World Bank meeting last week, or actually this week, in Washington, D.C. And as you can recall or could recall, the data was not really gloomy that was presented. After all, we have an ECB president who found out when inflation was already in full swing that it is not transitory, but it is a serious case, and those who believe in Austrian economics, and I assume most friends of IREF and pro-market people knew that it takes a couple of reasons for inflation. It's not only QE that we have undergone ever since the great financial crisis hit Europe. We have, risen our sovereign debt rates accordingly, but this is one reason. The next reasons were, of course, COVID, with a tremendous spending. Prior to that, we have announced the so-called Green Deal, and by the EU, and back then. All of a sudden, energy prices rose. Surprise, surprise. To many, obviously, there was no direct correlation between the time gap of innovation that companies could invest and put new technologies in, and the adaptation, or actually the adaptation of the markets in the price rises of energy. So this was a surprise, and we saw the first sparks of inflation, as a matter of fact, immediately after the Green Deal in Europe, both by the ECB, or the Green Finance by the ECB, and the Green Deal by the European Commission was announced in 2018. And then the next thing, as I mentioned, was COVID, when the supply chains broke up, and when supply chains are being broken up, supply and demand and price distortions are seen, and these actually are the classic reasons for inflation. when prices, when supply and demand don't match anymore. I mean, we've seen that back in the 70s for the last time, big deal. There was only one external shock. Now we have already 3 external shocks, and the fourth was then finally the war between Russia and Ukraine. That was the last trigger, but before that, we have all those little things that amount to huge problems that I will show you in a second. But what we, and when I was listening, or when we were listening probably to Dr. Eamonn Butler before, many things with regards to Brexit were taken for granted by politicians and by bigger publicity or public. We thought when Brexit was voted, well, it's a deal, it's done, it's out and over. For me, as an Austrian, I'd say, and probably for many of you, it was sad to see Great Britain leave, because for us this was a voice of reason. After all, asking to to stick to certain rules like the Maastricht criteria, etc. And when they left, things overboarded, and it took obviously more than 6 years, and they are still not out because certain people don't want that. So the thing that we think all Europeans are equally the same, I don't think that this is true. I think we are luckily different, and there is a lot of diversity, and this is what has helped Europe become big and successful in history. So this is a good part of it, and this is the only, I think, one of the few hopes that we have still left. Because, to be honest, we have outsourced in Europe, we've outsourced our security to the US. We have outsourced our energy provision, apart from the nuclear power plants, some of them in France that are still running. The Germans have turned them off now. But we have outsourced our energy provision to Russia, and we have outsourced the production of cheap industrial goods to China. So what is left for Europe? Whoops, nothing. What is left for Europe, really? The next generation and their creativity. Well, after COVID, with some people, you think, what is life, work balance, and the lack of productivity that we see these days, on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, if we have over-regulation that literally straps enterprises off their opportunity to be efficient and effective on the one hand, and on the other hand, we overtax them, what is there to invest here in Europe? So we really need to be more creative on that front. And something else as well, our big neighbors or other continents don't sleep. They are much more competitive than we are. In general, is Europe. Of course, there are always exemptions, luckily, but I still would like to have you to discuss that. So the poly crisis, I think you have heard enough of that, and I would simply just remind us of those couple of issues that we've seen with regards to our sovereign, to our national budgets. And if we look at, in average, the Western European budgets, 2/3 of those nation budgets are actually dedicated to the past, more or less, in average, because we have to take care of our pension system, and we have to take care of the social security. And where do we invest? Not in education and not in other things that we need for the future. So this is an issue of the Western world that we have not solved. And the biggest issue is the decline of productivity. And I will show you another slide later when it comes to interest and the decline of R star, the natural interest rate. This is just a reminder. I will hop over those slides, but just to see what has happened during COVID. Then the next support packages on energy, that we have, literally took a lot of money into our hands to support individuals, but also companies when those last two crises came up. There is something, and here I'm wearing my central bank hat, and I also have to apologize that I try to be very neutral on that front, but as an Austrian economist, I believe in sound money, and unfortunately, this is something that we have not followed on various central banks, in whether it was the Fed, whether it was the Bank of England, or our European Central Bank. But here is something that Alice Revlin, one of the former Fed vice chairs, said in the 90s. So it's the job of the central banks to worry. When we have to fulfill price stability, which we definitely failed over the past 3 years, and actually have not seen it beforehand. And second is the stability of the financial markets. And we've seen in Europe the Credit Suisse and a couple of other banks kind of shaking. We have seen the Silicon Valley Bank. However, totally two different reasons why those banks have issues or were in trouble and have had to be bailed out. But still, the GFC, the Grand Financial Crisis, the memories of that are coming back. And we have built the European Stability Mechanism in 2010, 2012. However, the amount of money that we have produced since with the API, the Asset Purchasing Program, and that we have still on the balance sheet of the central bank is tremendous. It's 3.7 trillion that we have sitting there, and we reduce it only by 15 billion per month. So it's a lot of money that is still in circulation. These are just the average inflation rates that we've seen, and just to remind you, the core inflation still remains very high in the Eurozone, or in the Euro area. Energy crisis confirms the need to end the dependence on fossil fuels. Yes, of course. But again, the time lag that we need, or that we are forced in by now to overcome this takes a while to find the new solutions, and definitely destroying one's industry by and I'm talking about Germany, for example, by destroying the combustion engines, or at least the industry that produce combustion engines, and replace it with e-cars, which finally politicians find out that e-cars are run, or electricity is produced by gas. And where does the gas come from? Surprise, surprise. So now these are all the lags that we have undergone. The greening of the economy, and I mentioned at the very beginning, we already made calculations at the beginning of 2017, when we knew that the Green Deal was coming, that 0.5% of the inflation is due to the change of the greening. Don't get me wrong, of course we need to take the steps towards net zero, and to make sure that our environment is safe. But we have to use many, many more tools in order to save our planet, and not just one thing. Those are just data that you all know, but there is something that I would like to remind you of. That the task of the central bank is to, of course, make sure that financial stability is there, and that we can provide financing our governments. So on the one hand, we have to look at the interest rates, the paybacks of the interest rates. This is the left graph, and it's Germany in light blue, Austria in pink, Italy in yellow, and Spain in green. So these are the interest rates in relation to GDP, and the other side is the debts in percentage of GDP. So we have to make sure while we cover those costs or pay those prices, on the other hand, the government bonds go up, and the average interest of our government bonds, the amount goes up, and the interest goes down, which for a while at least, but it has reversed now. So finally, we go back to normalization of our monetary policy as of last June, and we were 1 year later than the Fed already was done. These are the 3.3 that I mentioned, and the EPP is the yellow part. This is the PEP, the Pandemic Emergency Program that we just built, 1.7 trillion in 2 years. I mean, back then, 10 years ago, I mean, if you remember, we were all worried about the APP programs, which for 10 years, 3.3 is nothing in contrast to what we have built in 2 years. Apologies. So, how financial markets were affected, I've already mentioned that. The exhaustion of the fiscal space is enormous. Sorry, I was on air-conditioned or in air-conditioned rooms for way too long, which is not healthy. This is a nice reminder of the secular decline of the natural interest rate. The very left side is 1300, when it was at some points even above 20-25%, and there were issues even when we had it by 35%. This is a graph from the Bank of England, but you see the decline until now, and the reasons actually why there was a secular decline over the past years it's a global phenomenon, is the lack of productivity, population aging, the excess savings over investments. Those things have actually reduced interest and the QE programs, after all, because we all know what interest is. And the interesting thing is also that the estimates of the real equilibrium interest rate in the euro area currently still stand at just under 0%. So in order to raise that, we need to go back to a normalization of monetary policy, which we have started slowly. But this is not the only political tool or policy tool. So we need also to go back to sound politics. And what I mean by that is structural reforms, cut spending, and solve our pension problems, solve our sovereign debt crisis, and definitely not go into further excessive spending, and reduce regulation, definitely to unfree the economy. And here is just one example of how much the regulation costs for the financial sector. So it definitely exceeds the benefits. This is just European banking, the costs of that. And as French, you know many other industries that could add to that. So let's look at the recovery, the good times. What can we do in order to get back on track in Europe? Hitting the wall is the hardest way. Reducing our welfare and our growth is already there. Our well-being, yes, we will definitely live a less affluent life in the next couple of years. This is the sad news, but the good news is once we have undergone this creative destruction a la Schumpeter, we will hopefully be back on track and will be as creative as we were before. Let's just look at the monetary policy before I stop. So the elements, the sequence, and the pace of monetary policy normalization needs to be much faster than we have done it, and we should have done it much earlier. We have waited way too long, and this is a big critique. And of course, we still have risks of fragmentation with regards to especially the southern countries. But I'm sure that those who are now in Italy will solve the problem in a different way than was foreseen. As I mentioned, we are in a dilemma, and I mean Frankfurt is in a dilemma because the current models we have these days in place don't function. The good news is, before COVID, actually, Madame Lagarde had set up a group to discuss, and to a group of economists to discuss the modeling of inflation and all our issues. But then came COVID and everything was forgotten. Now we are just focusing on CBDCs, on digital central banking currencies, which is also a total different issue, but a very interesting issue, but doesn't have anything to do with our blockchain technologies or cryptos, what we've heard before. And the business case definitely needs to be found there beforehand. But I would say I'll leave it with that and say thank you for your attention. Looking forward to questions if there are any. Otherwise, oops, yeah, that's a nicer picture. That should be the best way. Are there? Yes.
Thank you for your speech. I'm Bruno, president of Environmentalists for Nuclear Energy, not against. For. Of course, the way forward, you presented solutions that are monetary solutions, but the crisis we are in is also a very big, major energy crisis. It's the second time it happens in modern history. There was 1973, 74 with the first oil shock, and we're living something similar but even worse than in the 70s. What's very surprising is the response of the different governments, and especially in Europe. In 1973-74 in France, where the politicians decided there are three solutions: energy efficiency, renewables, and nuclear energy. When you look at the lessons learned from these three solutions, energy efficiency was a half success. Of course, homes are better insulated now, but even though we did everything we could about energy efficiency, the energy consumption continued to grow since the 1970s. The renewables were a total flop. They don't work. And nuclear energy, at least in France, was a huge success. Now we have the same energy crisis hitting again, but worse. But the reactions of the politicians are completely crazy. We have those three same solutions, and they are all running after the solution that didn't work. And no one talks about the solution that works: nuclear energy. So my question is, how can we get people to open their eyes about the nuclear solution? Because that may be an even more important answer than the monetary solution.
Well, thank you for this question. I'm not an engineer by training, but we have looked into a couple of technologies, and what we see on the, why I say we, is on the one hand both the group of libertarians and free market people at the central bank, and there is just a handful, one of them, but also at our think tanks and those investors who we work with, the free market, those guys. There is the mini nukes Mini nukes are there. There is. I actually have a presentation here that I had sent to Prince Michael of IREF with regards to modern technology on nuclear, the spins of nuclear. So it's not a power plant, but it's a melting of nuclear. Sorry, I'm just no technician. I could only tell you in German. But there are ways out. But the problem is nuclear all of a sudden is green anyhow by the European Commission after the Germans have turned their nuclear power plants off, which is ridiculous. And I can only talk of the Austrian perspective. We have had a green government, and this green government in many of our provinces, and they have constantly prohibited the opening of hydro and the usage of hydropower plants in the entire country. We, like you, have Alps, and we could use this more efficiently. What we do now, we create wind parks in the Alps where you can't even use them because either the wind is too strong or there is no wind. And it would not work. But of course, this is what some politicians think. So to me, I think it's the markets should allow and decide and make the solutions. And this has always happened, not without political interference. I'm sorry. I mean, we can only all lobby for that. That's our task as libertarians, as pro-market people, that we open the eyes of our politicians. Sorry, cannot give you a different answer. But we are working on it.
Both the mini use, it's not really proven yet. And it's not sure it'll be much better or much more economical. At least we have a solution that works. The standard use.
Yeah. But
then we can develop the mini use and wait and see.
But until a nuclear power plant is starting to work, it takes, like with all the processes, all the bureaucratic steps, all the licensing and everything, it takes like 50 years. And what shall we do 50 years from now? I mean, this is ridiculous.
In 1973, when the shock suddenly abruptly occurred, France decided its nuclear program, and we built 60 reactors in 20 years. 3 reactors per year. Now this year, Germany is stopping 3 reactors in the middle of the big crisis. It's completely crazy. It means we're going straight into the wall, fall off the cliff.
Well, I told you, we will have to hit the wall before it gets better again. It's too bad, sorry. I wish I could say something different, but let's be realistic. No, I have depressed you totally, I'm sorry. Any other questions, or shall we? Yes, please.
Could you conceive of a breakup of the Eurozone? Is it part of your reflections, of your thoughts for the future, prospective thoughts?
To be honest, I had thought that the Eurozone would break up already in 2012. But I was really naive and did not believe in the political power and consistency that they thought we need to have this program, this concept of the euro, that we need to keep it up. Now, after more than 10 years having kicked the can down the road, because this is nothing else what the numbers show, we are in a much bigger issue, in a much bigger problem. So eventually there is a good reason why I used the term CBDCs, and one seeks a way out of the mess, but I don't think that CBDCs are of course no solution. They just disguise the current problem that we have. And so we will kick the can down the road for another while, unless smart politicians stand up and say, hey, we stick to our own rules, like the Maastricht criteria, and we reduce our debt levels, and we live at bay again. But this needs the new Thatchers, to be honest, who are able to reform and to speak up and are focused on what needs to be done. And I don't see that with the majority of the politicians in Europe these days. So we will kick the can down the road for another while.
Yes, but at the end, what would be the scenario for Brexit? How will it happen? What would happen?
If I knew, I would be well. Yes, not only that, but I would not stand here because I believe in what Hayek said, that it would be arrogant to predict certain things that you cannot predict. And there is this certain thing of pretense of knowledge in society. I simply do not know. I can only take what I see, observe, and combine what we have seen in the past and what has worked or has not worked, but it would be arrogant. I wish certain things would happen. But
let's assume fiscal policies are different in the EU, in Eurozone, as they already are. So fiscal deficits in the south and fiscal virtue or frugality in the north. Let's assume it goes on. Then what would happen?
then something will happen like Brexit, because people will simply say, why should we redistribute our wealth, which is currently anyhow being reduced due to inflation and other political issues. So why should we redistribute our wealth to other countries? And then you will have raise-ups. This is inevitably. I think I was clear enough. Others? No. Well, then thank you very much. Elodie, may I give the microphone back to you?
C'est la fin de cette conférence. Merci beaucoup à tous d'être venus. Thank you all for coming. There are still some books behind the scene if you want to take some. It's made by l'IREF. N'oubliez pas que alors l'IREF est un think tank européen. C'est vrai qu'on n'a pas vraiment eu le temps de se présenter au départ. On vit principalement grâce aux dons privés. Donc n'hésitez pas à déjà regarder ce qu'on fait, nos articles, à aller sur notre site, de vous abonner à notre newsletter et éventuellement nous faire un don si vous adhérez à nos idées et à nos actions. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.